Hi, I'm Cindy,
Hi, I'm Tiffany.
and we're exploring whole language versus structured literacy and culture around it. All right, so
Okay.
Tiff, we were talking today about one of my students, and I was saying
Mm-hmm.
there is a whole culture
Mm-hmm.
around literacy instruction. Now, what do you understand of
Right.
literacy instruction?
What I understand about literary instruction is breaking down. Oh, I am getting a little nervous, but breaking down in terms of how individuals learn, in terms of whether it's structured and how. Okay, actually, I'm not sure how much I know about it.
Okay, so a whole language approach says we use context and visuals to cue kids to
Mm-hmm.
read.
Right.
So you watched a video of me working with a kid that I was teaching to read, and you
Right.
noticed that I was following the text,
Mm-hmm.
my cursor as I versus pointing at the picture to cue the kid as to what the word was, so that the kid was reading
Right.
the picture instead of reading the words.
Right. I was wondering why you were putting through that, and especially the kid was able to follow through once you did highlight and kind of pattern to that structure.
Right. So
Mm-hmm.
a whole language approach believes that if we expose kids to rich literature, if we teach them to use context and experience to read, they will naturally learn to read.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the research literature is super clear that that doesn't work. If you look at the national reading scores
Mm-hmm.
in reading over the past 30 plus years,
Mm-hmm.
you can clearly see that students are not making the gains in reading. So
Oh, wow.
this is the trend. So this gray line here, which you can barely see, is considered fourth grade proficiency. And you'll notice all of these scores, which vary a little, have made no significant gains in reading using a whole language approach. And by the way, this continues into eighth grade and then continues into high school. Okay.
Okay.
So there's a term out there called the reading wars. And the reading wars are people that want to hold to whole language
Mm-hmm.
versus those of us that want to move to structured literacy. And structured
Mm-hmm.
literacy is how do I break words down? How do I help
Yeah.
kids sound out unfamiliar words? How do let me pull up another slide here really quick.
And
So
another,
go ahead.
so I was saying, I think that a lot of kids that I deal with or maybe or work with, they kind of go by memorization, right? And also kind of like context clues. And I see that that kind of over time, it does impact them when we get into high school or college or even earlier than that, middle school when they're reading paragraphs. And that, yes. Do you agree with
Yeah,
that, Cindy, as well? Okay.
100%. So kids have learned rote memorization, and rote memorization only works for so long. I don't know if
Right.
you remember, I remember sitting in biology class. I read the biology book, and then I would walk
Mm-hmm.
in, and the professor would be talking about something and write a word on the board and
Mm-hmm.
pronounce it in a different way. I'm like, oh, that's
Oh,
what he's been talking about, because I never knew how to break the word down, sound it out, and blend it back together. Okay.
I
Yet I
definitely had
taught
that
that my
experience.
dyslexia
Mm-hmm.
of not being able to hear and manipulate sounds, as you have experienced me doing in other contexts, I didn't know how to do this. And I did not learn
Mm-hmm.
this until I went to graduate school and went outside and got training
Training.
in Orton Gillingham.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so the tenets of structured literacy say we work on phonology, which is how are the sounds made in the mouth and how do we differentiate between sounds? Sound symbol
Right.
correspondence. Here's a letter, a grapheme. Here's how it maps to these phonemes or a phoneme.
Mm-hmm.
What are the syllable types and the rules of syllable division? Morphology. How do prefix, suffix, and roots affect how a word has meaning
Mm-hmm.
and how you can break it up? And then syntax and semantics. Syntax is how do we structure language when we read, and semantics is how do we gain meaning out of it. And
Mm-hmm.
so this is this is a whole different approach to
Right.
reading. Now, interestingly, whole language tends to work on the syntax and semantics, and they occasionally incorporate the morphology.
Mm-hmm.
And if we go to, there's a very famous thing called Scarborough's reading rope, which I am scrolling to right here. So whole
Wow.
language tends to work up here in the language component of the comprehension piece, and it misses this lower level piece, which is how do I decode the unfamiliar words?
And I want to also mention kind of what we were talking about with when I see that there's background knowledge and facts and concepts. And we were talking about households that have that fluidity and that exposure to it. And let's say if you don't have that exposure, then where is that also aligned with that?
Yes.
Hmm.
So if you don't come from a house with deep language knowledge, with lots of experience, you're trying to build knowledge and context based on what's brought into the
Hmm.
classroom. Okay. So
Hmm.
whole language focuses on this upper component of the reading rope,
Right.
the language component, and misses this lower piece.
Hmm.
And teachers have become very wed to this methodology because it's known, it's familiar, it's comfortable.
Hmm.
And they're missing how important that lower piece is, in part because
Absolutely.
they themselves don't know it. They haven't been taught it. It is not part of their teacher program. And
Hmm.
so it's missing. And
Right.
they have then held a deeply held belief system that whole language is the appropriate way to teach reading. And if it worked and worked effectively,
Why
in national
change?
reading scores, we would see 85, 90, 95% readers, and we don't.
No, we see that across the board, just
We
kind of
see it
what you.
across the board. And
Hmm.
so we send our students off. So there's about 30, 35% of the population that
Hmm.
will naturally learn to read. And my brother was one of them. My
Hmm.
brother, as a kindergartner, was brought into a second grade classroom
Hmm.
and asked to read the newspaper to the kids in the classroom as a
Right.
model of what good reading looked like.
Hmm.
But he was one of those people that naturally got the code. And then his
Right.
dyslexic sister comes along, which my parents didn't know at the time I was dyslexic.
Right.
And the teacher sending home decks of cards to drill and kill, trying to teach me to
Hmm.
memorize words.
Right. And over time, the effectiveness, I'm sure that you saw through high school and college when you had to start reading grad school paper, research papers, and that really impacted not only the reading, but our students' confidence and how do we approach reading.
So there's two tracks that dyslexic readers tend to go,
Hmm.
and don't overgeneralize this. You have slow, laborious readers, which is one class, and fast, inaccurate readers. I am the fast, inaccurate reader. I will read
Okay.
at lightning speed because I use lots of context clues and lots of language to help me figure out what I missed.
Hmm.
But that also has like hamstrung me in other places, and it affects me in other ways as a compensatory mechanism.
Hmm.
So I am a reader. I read lots. Ask me to read aloud, and I have to like completely shut everything else out and just focus on reading material.
Hmm.
If I've never seen it before, I don't read as fluidly. That said, I have read the diagnostic test so many times. I can
Yeah.
do that beautifully. That's not a big deal, but it
Hmm.
it affects me in all sorts of different ways. But again, we go
Yeah.
back to a culture in the public school system of teachers
Yeah.
holding on to a methodology because it's familiar, because it's
Yes.
known to them, because they have a belief system in it despite evidence.
And it's worked for them in the past, but there's also new students that are coming in, different backgrounds, different culture, different language systems, different structures.
But it
So,
didn't work for them in the past, and they didn't see that it wasn't working.
I see. Yeah.
Those kids just weren't whatever, weren't trying hard enough, didn't have the right background, da 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 da. You excuse away the majority of learners. Now, one of my colleagues who teaches in the public school system at the high school level was
Hmm.
asked for a teacher training day to talk about structured literacy.
Hmm.
And she pulled up iReady. Do you know what iReady is?
Yes, I've heard about it.
It's an assessment system. It's
Yes.
an online take a quiz and we'll figure out where your score sits. She sat down and walked teachers through iReady scores and walked them through the foundations of structured literacy.
Yeah.
And all of the high school teachers were like, why aren't we teaching this? And she said the most interesting thing was the
Hmm.
only people that did not come to her discussion on how to teach reading was the English language department,
Oh, fascinating.
which would be
Did
the ones that would be teaching reading.
oh, did they
It's a whole backstory on that, but
but
you actually have to be curious. You have to want to know. You want to dig deeper. And it is really hard. The cognitive dissonance, that struggle within yourself to hold
hmm
what I was taught to do
hmm
and I've been doing wasn't effective for however many years I've been teaching. How do you
right.
rectify that within yourself?
And that's a tough question, and you have to be advocates for these students and to really dive deep and be passionate, is what
But
I
does that
feel.
explain why teachers don't want to give that up?
Yes. Yes, it does.
I can't deal
Familiarity.
with the thought that for however many years I've been teaching, I have been misserving my students.
Mhm. Yep. And to reframe that into wanting to grow and develop. But that's really hard, I feel like, with your internal dialect and your dialogue. Dialogue.
And if the school is not behind the shift and the change, and you haven't seen what can happen with other instructional methodologies,
Hmm.
why would you buy into it? It's just
Agree?
another fad, right?
Yes.
And there's also a misbelief, especially in middle and high school, that that was
Hmm.
early elementary ed's job was to teach that, so it's not our job anymore. They should come.
Well,
This is their failing, so we don't have to do anything, right?
yeah.
So it's a real challenge. The good news is through legislation. So, for example, in Washington State, the legislature has made the determination that in K through
Hmm.
2, we will use structured literacy curriculum, which is a step
Hmm.
in the right direction. We need to
Right.
do K through 8, and we need to require all special education teachers to be trained in the
Trained.
tenets of structured literacy.
And that's for a good, great first step, at least when you're talking about it comes from above so that we can start implementing it to the gen ed teachers
Yeah,
or teachers in general.
yeah.
Mhm.
So it's a whole cultural shift. Many of the professors that are teaching have taught whole language. So again,
Hmm.
we're asking them to do the cognitive dissonance of what you've believed in. We're going to debunk, even though they've written research on it saying it's right.
Right.
It's a huge change to make.
Yes, I can
And with
see
that, if
that.
this is helpful, please let us know, like us, and we'll see you
Subscribe.
soon.